Hey everybody, this is MIRC. We are doing a panel roundtable today on transgender athletes in rugby and in sport more generally. This is in recognition of Transgender Day of Visibility, which is on March 31st, and we're really excited to have an open and safe space for us to discuss this topic amongst current, former, and players from both the men's and the women's side. Maggie is going to be our moderator for the event, and she's going to be asking us some questions just as prompts for the discussion, and then we'll take it from there.
Okay, we're going to start with introductions. My name is Maggie Rickard. I've been playing with NYRC for about a year. I play front row, and I use any pronouns.
I'm Grace McKenzie. I've been playing with NYRC for about 2 years. I've been playing rugby for about 5 years now. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm a transgender woman.
Hey everyone, my name is Rick. I've been playing with York Rugby Club for a little over 7 years now. I've also been an active board member for that same amount of time, and I'm currently the vice chairman of the board. And I play hooker.
Hi, my name is Jordan. I played on the NYRC women's side from 2009 to 2014, and I use gender neutral pronouns. I identify as a transmasculine person, and I'm just really happy to be in this space with everybody else.
My name is Chad Hansen. I've been with the club for about 12 years. I've served on the board in a bunch of capacities. Right now I'm the vice president of the men's team, and I use he, him.
Okay, so the first question for everyone is what brought you to rugby and what does it mean to you?
Yeah, happy to go first. Very sort of humble beginnings. I knew nothing about the sport. I had just moved to New York City. This can be a tough place to make friends, like anywhere. Really missed organized sports. I had played my entire life. Was missing that sense of community, missing the camaraderie. Was lucky enough to make a friend who introduced me to the sport, and my first practice I remember getting my chest and face stepped on and fell in love with the game ever since. I'm sure a lot of other folks share that same experience. It's been a really phenomenal type of experience for me in general, right? Like the people that I've met, the opportunities that I've had to not only contribute to the club, but also what it's given to me. It's been something that I think there is a before and after rugby moment in terms of my life.
For sure. So as I mentioned, I started playing about 5 years ago in San Francisco, actually. And I was recruited from a lesbian bar in San Francisco a year and a half into my gender transition. Rugby was a huge lifeline for me. I had been an athlete my entire life, and I had internalized a lot of things that I have come to now know as kind of inaccuracies or myths about being trans in sports. And I was approached to join this rugby team. I had never played rugby before, and I was quite worried that I wouldn't be allowed because it was a women's rugby team. The team was like, we don't care. It's open to everybody. It's women's rugby. As long as you're crazy enough to get on the pitch, we want to have you here. So I went out to my first practice, and 5 years later, I never looked back. I love this sport. It's the best sport I've ever played.
I started playing in college as a club sport. I was just looking for a way to meet people and be more active, and ended up falling in love with it. I think my favorite part about it is just the community and like always knowing that I have friends in lots of states, other countries. I always have like people that I can go to if I need something, and I really like that.
Cool. I came to rugby. I was a soccer player growing up. It was my first love. And I played soccer in college for 2 years at Colgate, and then I transferred from Colgate to Wesleyan. And I knew I didn't want to play like on the university level, and so I was looking for sports. I love sports. It's how I connect with people. It's how I feel good about my body itself. And Wesleyan has a rugby team that's also a gender inclusive team. I was not out as a gender queer person at the time. I was identifying as a woman and playing the sport through that lens and identity. But I found rugby to be such an incredibly the sport that just like respects and loves all bodies in this way that I really appreciated, and it made me feel like there's a place not just for me but for so many other kinds of people as well. And then I joined NYRC and met my best friends and met my wife and partner through the team. So I would say that it has really foundational, really and life transformational connections for me.
Yeah, I started playing when I joined UCLA, actually pretty late in my college career because I'd been playing soccer growing up, and then I was doing individual sports like shooting and racquetball, but I missed team sports. Team sports, they do more stuff, it's cool. So I was choosing between, like I said, friends on the ultimate team, and man, would that have been different if that had been my life. But I ended up picking rugby because I saw it on TV and it looked great. And yeah, I can't imagine anything having had more impact on my life. Like who I've dated, where I went to school, none of those things have changed my life as much as rugby did. You can go anywhere in the world and you just find the local rugby club. You've got friends, you've got exercise, you've got parties, you've got lodging, you've got work, you've got everything you need is there because it's that community no matter what you do. So it's everything.
And what makes you feel welcome at NYRC?
I think generally in the sport of rugby, this will probably get talked about a lot, but it makes me feel very welcome because there are people of all different shapes and sizes and strength and speed and things like that. So I feel really adept at my position as a flanker, but I know I'd be really terrible as a scrum half and really bad as a prop, probably. NYRC in particular has been a really, really inclusive and welcoming community for me because I knew from the outset that the women's team and the club in general valued diversity, equity, and inclusion. You know, we had a code of conduct. I knew that there were other folks on the team who were queer identified. There were some folks who identified as non-binary. So I knew stepping into that space, it was going to be one that I was included in. And just generally, I know that regardless of the club that I go to, the sport just has that as a foundational value. So didn't really skip a beat when I moved from San Francisco, playing for the Berkeley All Blues, joined NYRC and felt the exact same welcoming environment that I did out there.
Yeah, I think same thing for me. I think the first thing that caught my attention when I first joined the club was exactly what you mentioned, all shapes and sizes first and foremost, all skill level, right? Like literally walking onto the pitch and not knowing the rules of the game, having someone take me to the side, explain to me what going into touch meant, right? And like why we call it touchdown, and why American football calls it touchdown, right? Like literally have to touch the ball down, like simple rules like that were explained to me. And I think it aligns with like what rugby values are, like as a sport, right? It talks about integrity, it talks about being true to yourself and being respectful to the opponent, being respectful to the ref, right? Like you look at some other sports and the way they talk to the ref is, kind of look at it and you're like, how can people talk like that, right? Like especially if you consider what rugby values are and the way that they sort of treat the refs and the opponent and how you hold yourself accountable, try to be the best person that you can. And then I think also, right, like when I first joined the club, it was all walks of life, right? Like I remember going into my first practice and it was conversations and chit-chatting with guys and they were like, yeah, I'm a bartender. The other one was a person who worked in finance. The other one was a person who was a construction worker. The other one was a teacher, right? And the only thing they cared about was like, are you willing to come out Tuesday, Thursdays through rain, sleet, snow? Are you down to have a beer with us on Thursday if that's what you're into? What type of person are you going to be? And if it's the 78th minute in the game, are you going to be willing to stand next to me and make that tackle? But like, that's all that mattered. So having that opportunity to really be around like-minded people that were willing to just look at me in terms of what I can contribute on the field and off the field, that was just a feeling of home when you first sort of met the people that kind of thought the same way and prioritized the same things.
Yeah, I mean, so I joined a year after I graduated from college, and was moving back to the city. I grew up here, but NYRC was like this foundation of just my new social world and life. And I always found, one of the things I loved about the team right away is that there's actually a lot of age diversity within NYRC as well. And so we had, on the women's side especially as well, we had like people who were a generation older who just like welcomed everybody into this tradition, this spirit, this ritual. And one of the most foundational things was just like, be who you are here. Like, let your freak flag fly, whatever that looks like for you, and let it be just authentically you. And rugby is a space where I think across the board, you can be, that spirit of liberation really came out for me. And being on a women's team and playing women's sports, I love women's sports so much. I think they are like the symbols of how the world should be. And they just truly are like an incredibly queer inclusive place. And so I think just finding yourself inside of a majority queer environment as a person, for me, trying to like really listen to my core, having a team behind me in that way, to be able to like be on the pitch with people and put your body on the line with people, that is a very vulnerable thing to do, and I think that level of trust is unique when you build that when you're playing something like rugby. So I've just felt that way about NYRC since the beginning.
Yeah, what resonated most with me is, I've heard a little bit from everybody, is that everyone has a place there. you're fast, if you're slow, if you're big, if you're weak, if you're funny, if you're not, if you're organized, if you're not. Everybody has something they contribute. There's all range of everybody on your team, and there's a place for everybody. You even can see it in like pros when you watch a Lions documentary. You still see them on buses having beers after the game or whatever, because they all grew up as players too, just playing the game because they liked it. And even at their elite professional level, you can still tell you could go hang out with them and there would be not even a bat of an eye. So, and I think that permeates the entire culture, and I just always really like that.
What does everyone know about Trans Day of Visibility, and what does it mean to you?
Trans Day of Visibility is a day where trans people get the opportunity to share information about our experiences, how they differ from cisgender people or non-trans folks, our culture, which I think is really unique and beautiful. I think right now it's a really important day. There's a lot of politicization of transgender identities, conversations around where we fit into society, and because we're quite a small population, like less than 1 in 4 Americans actually know an openly out transgender person. If you don't have that one-on-one connection with somebody, it's hard to empathize with their experience, understand what they're going through, and then be able to kind of cut through some of that misinformation to really know what's going on. So this day is always a really exciting opportunity for me to share that stuff about myself that I'm proud of, and also to just be an example for folks who might be struggling with this kind of stuff internally or quietly, letting them know that there are people like myself that they can reach out to and have these conversations if they need that kind of support.
And also, as a trans person, I think the main thing I think about on days like this is, there are lots of people who can't be out for lots of different reasons, and being able to be a proud, visible trans person, I see that as like a responsibility and a privilege if I have it, to be able to, hopefully be in a position where that outness and that visibility creates connection and makes somebody who maybe doesn't feel safe feel the possibility of that safety. So it is really important, and it is really important to me personally. I also work for an organization right now called Athlete Ally that sits right at the intersection of LGBTQ plus rights and sports. And so thinking a lot about this, just this year, how we're leveraging all of the community, all the people building the world's biggest team of folks that really do want to stand up for often some of the most marginalized members of our community. And trans visibility is a way that in telling these stories, we can start to really do that, build that narrative and build that team.
This is actually the first, I didn't know this was a holiday, I know this was an awareness day yet. Glad to find out about it, because it probably means there's some bars doing some really cool parties, and now I know I want to do that. So that's great. And I mean, I'm a big individualist. I believe everybody deserves to be who they are, and that should be absolutely celebrated. So the more events and days like this, the better.
Okay. I think I first heard about it when I first moved to New York City, and going back like days now. Growing up in the community that I grew up in, discussions around trans people in general, just a topic of discussion that came up very often. So moving to New York City and obviously coming to a place where tons of diversity from all different backgrounds and all walks of life, it was a really sort of interesting moment to catch yourself and say hey, I didn't know anything about this, right? So being able to educate yourself on the subject, being able to meet great trans athletes and other people has been an eye-opening experience for me, and obviously leaning into events like this and anything that brings awareness and people to the table to have open and honest discussions in a place that's safe, all for it.
I think that's a huge testament to what we all talk about the rugby community, just being everybody's all in for each other. You guys had never heard about the day, and you're yeah, I'll be on the round table about it. Why not? Let's talk about it. Let's get into it. So that's just really awesome. I'm really stoked to hear.
Okay, so for the non-trans athletes, when did you first encounter the conversation around trans athletes in sports, and do you remember your first reaction to that topic?
I ran into it first when I'm also a big administrator for Say Touch, which is the national touch rugby organization, and we have a big national tournament every year. And I guess it was maybe 3 or 4 years. It was a year right before COVID, I think. And it was the first time we actually had to make a policy decision, because it was somebody that wanted to play that maybe wasn't registered right. I forget the exact detail, but somehow this question came up. And I was kind of surprised, because I just didn't think it was going to be an issue anybody had to worry about in terms of I didn't think there'd be any controversy. People could play where they want to play. But it came up, and we had to basically end up just deferring to a parent organization, because we weren't kind of sort of equipped at the policy level to come up with anything specific to us. But that was the first time that it came up, having to like answer that question of like, can somebody play? And thankfully, the policy was good, everybody could play, there was no issues at all, which is obviously the better outcome.
Yeah, I didn't have a real first-hand experience, but I think my experience was probably very similar to maybe the general public, right? Like I first heard about it in the media, right? Like I first heard about it in the news. And I think what you hear in the news is perhaps obviously not the most accurate picture. You're probably not getting both sides of the story. And I think representation, right? Like you don't realize that it's not there until you realize that you're having conversations with people and you're hearing different points of view, right? So for me, hearing it in the media first and hearing about trans athletes, right? Very different perspective, very different story. And then obviously joining New York Rugby Club, where we are more so focused on inclusion, more so focused on being able to be open and welcoming to as many different folks as we can. It just opened up my eyes to a lot of different topics, a lot of different perspectives. So I feel much more able and comfortable to be able to have that discussion today than I was maybe 10 years ago.
I feel like that's here from a lot of like non-transgender folks that they do encounter this first in the media. And one of the things that does frustrate me as a trans person is like I'll read articles or like see video segments or whatever, and they never actually talk to a trans person about these issues, right? And it's always like, doctor, how do you feel about this? Oh, you don't treat trans patients? Okay, but I want your opinion on it, you know? And it's like, it bothers me because I'm like, you could just ask me about like what my experience was in it, you know? Like what's been great, what's been not so great, you know, how do I even feel about this topic of inclusion, right? Because I think in the trans community there are different opinions depending on who you ask, right? It's not just this monolith, but yeah, that's what I hear from a lot of folks. It's the media first, and we know media can not always tell the most accurate side of the story, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah, it's a really important part of why also like who is telling the story is important. Think about like sports journalism, you think about who the writers are. There's a lot of research that folks on my team do about this exact issue. And even just in the amount of TV, press, publications that are centered around trans athletes, you know, similar things that have been practiced for years and years and years, studied around just the implicit bias that exists and how that forms and creates a narrative without identifying the actual human. So just, you know, really there's a lot more to learn in this about how we are being sort of shaped and told and preached to in a way that can be overwhelming for all folks, regardless of their gender identity.
So for the trans athletes, what do you wish that the non-trans members of our club at any of the conversation knew about your experience as a trans player?
I've been thinking a bit about this question. I've been thinking a lot about this question because, and what it made me think about was I am the person who I am because of sports. Like absolutely hands down. Growing up playing sports shaped me to be who I am. Being able to join NYRC shaped my life in so many foundational and formative ways. And so I've been thinking a lot about this question because I feel like I have now. When I left playing NYRC in 2014, I wasn't on hormones. I was like starting to use gender neutral pronouns, but I wasn't yet I'm going through like a physical gender transition. And since then, I've really struggled to figure out where do I play sports. I can't play rugby anymore. I have bad knee. But I've really struggled to figure out like what does my adult sport life look like. And it is the thing in my life that brings me outside of like our baby and my partner and my family and closest friends the most joy, to be able to be like physically aligned in my body playing sports with people that I love. And I know, because I had that journey, I know what the absence of it feels like. I don't know that, for example, was never a musician. I can only make assumptions about like had I grown up as a musician, what music would have brought into my life. As a person who had the experience of learning what sports could bring into my life, and now feeling and witnessing an absence, and then making these like projections onto kids who are being restricted from playing sports because they are trans, I know that absence, and I want to be able to lift it up for non-trans people, non-trans athletes. Like, that joy that is not about have a trophy at the end of the day, but is about like taking the pitch with your closest people. It is about like what it feels like to just have that discipline, have that commitment, have that spirit. Those things are, in my opinion, like life-changing and rewarding, and all people deserve them. And so that is, for me, the like most important message that I want to be able to offer is knowing the difference of like what it is in my life to have access to sport and what it is in my life to not. And wanting, allies to be able to be a part of what makes the future more accessible to more people through sports.
So yeah, I just want to echo what you said really quickly. So for those who don't know, it's like pretty hard right now to be a trans person in public. There's a lot of heat that we're catching. There's a lot of hate going on out there. A lot of misinformation being spread about our lives. And even 5 years ago, when I had first came out, I was pretty alone in this journey. Like, I didn't know other trans people. I didn't even really know other queer people, and I was not good with my mental health. Like, things were not great. I didn't have sports as an outlet because I told myself I wasn't allowed to play sports. And then I found rugby, and like overnight, I had a team behind me of like 40 queer women and people, right? And it was like such a transformational change for me. So sport is not just about competing, it's about a community, and it's about having people who have your back, right? There are two specific things I want to talk about as like a trans woman. So trans women oftentimes get talked about as having this like innate competitive advantage, like taking opportunities away from other people. First, I'm a lifelong athlete. I've been in the gym for a decade plus. I can say that over the course of the time I've been on hormones, my athletic performance has decreased tremendously. Like, I was in the gym today, and I was like maxing my deadlifts like 135 pounds, and I could easily do over 200 before I came out, and that was something I had to recognize, which was kind of interesting. But secondly, this argument that really frustrates me is that quote unquote men are transitioning so that they can go into women's sports and like steal all these accolades and awards and money and all this kind of stuff. And I'm like, guys, if I show you the figures between like what male athletes and female athletes are really making out here.
Show me those posters, right?
Exactly, right? Like, where are the billboards of all the female athletes out there? It's kind of a preposterous argument. Like, people who are trans, who transition, go into sports because they want that support system, They want to push themselves, see what their athletic limits are, and it really helps you connect with a body that might be changing in different ways, right? So those are the things I would say. Like, I think sport is a human right. I truly believe that, and I think it's cruel to take it away from people, especially children, because a lot of the conversations around kids right now. I'm just really glad that I have access to it.
Matt and Rick, I feel like you guys have been really open to this conversation. Can you talk about your experience talking with your teammates about trans athletes in sports? If you have any experience.
I would say for me, it comes up occasionally, but not a lot. And at least the general vibe on all the teams I've ever been on is people are pretty open to it. I don't think anybody's ever expressed too many concerns. That might be a really limited view, and I'm sure there are people that have issues with it somewhere. But at least in our community, it's been pretty positive, and no one's screwed with it. It's not a non-issue for us at least.
I plus one to what Chad said. I think there's also an underlying understanding that when you join York Rugby Club, there is a certain standard that we hold you to in terms of like they're a non-negotiable club, right? Like, we do not condone transphobic comments. We do not condone any actions that are in any way exclusionary to any race, gender, age, right? Like I think Jordan mentioned earlier around their experience in terms of like how different people were in terms of ages. So like, we welcome everyone to the club, right? So I think in terms of the conversations that we've had, that's our stance. But to Chad's point, I don't think it comes up on a regular occasion, but I think it's just an understanding of like how we would approach a situation that did come up.
One of the things that I really hope this conversation just does for our club is like creates those safe spaces for you guys to like really get into it on this, versus just like, yeah, I think it would be cool. It's like, no, let's actually like talk about it. Like, what would that look like? How would we support like a trans man who wants to play I think when we were like planning out this panel, we talked about this a little bit. Like, I have this feeling as a trans person that sometimes folks who aren't trans have this comfortability to ask questions and, gather that information because you might be afraid of offending somebody. And I think a lot of the reason why we're in this weird place we are right now with the hate we're seeing is because we haven't been able to have these just safe space conversations. So again, I just think it's really awesome that you guys are here and open to have those conversations. And just for folks to know that it's okay to make mistakes. I make mistakes all the time with this kind of stuff, and I've been doing it for 5 years, right? So.
I wonder how much the issues are different for trans men joining a men's team versus trans women joining a women's team. Because obviously, things are sort of asymmetric in a lot of ways. Does anybody have what do we know are the most common issues that trans men would face joining our team? Does anybody have experience with that?
I've played mostly on AFAB, assigned female at birth teams that have gender expansive policies, and so I haven't played on any men's teams specifically, but I would imagine that, and I do feel men's sports in general compared to and in contrast to women's sports, especially when it comes to sexuality, sexual orientation, gender identity, just overall environments for queer people are very different, really different. And I think if NYRC is and wants to be across our teams a leader when thinking about inclusivity for all queer people, having a men's team be at the forefront of that in lots of ways is, I don't want to say more, it's not more meaningful, but it adds a level of actual real influence culturally that I think is significant. And so, that's also a power, I believe, as a men's club to be we're not only just kind of able to talk this talk or, want to be in this position of thinking about what hypothetically inclusivity looks like, but actively engaging in your own personal allyship to be we're gonna lead, we're gonna be in a position to lead the conversation and culture in men's rugby specifically. I believe that is power and powerful.
Honestly.
Yeah, it just is a really different environment and space, and I think that we have to acknowledge that, right? So I don't know exactly. I think the answer to your question is that we talked a little bit about this on the break, but women in general, trans, cis, whatever, are hyper scrutinized, right? So women's sports is hyper scrutinized. Trans women playing women's sports is hyper in the spotlight and scrutinized because of this idea that if you were born with male-assigned body parts at birth, that you are somehow inherited at sports is what people are trying to say when there's a fear-based response to this conversation about trans women playing women's sports. Making the same assumption that somebody not born with male-assigned body parts and genitalia at birth, transitioning and then joining a men's team would not be a threat to masculinity, to men's sports in the same way. And so 100%, I do not think that trans men face the same kind of, challenge, scrutiny, and I think in general, but at the same time, to be someone who was raised and reared as a female, which is a different life experience than a cis man, and I'm going to come into that space with some weirdness, right? With some this is a all except for me maybe cis male space. That's a different kind of lived experience and environment that I think it always is better to have, in my opinion, lots of kinds of diversity because it's how we evolve and grow. But we have to acknowledge those. I think it's important to acknowledge those differences in this conversation in particular.
I think, so I have some friends who have transitions or are, transmasculine and have hormones or what have you who do play men's sports, and they say a lot of those things, it's kind of a shock, right? It's different, and I know that having played men's sports my life, there's a different energy to it, and it's sometimes not so great, but it's different, right? I think we were talking about this before as well, and we're going to get into the USA Rugby policy. There's a lot of this talk about concern for safety of cis women, concern for fairness with cis women, so there's regulations in place around what trans women's bodies have to look like or how they have to operate. Whereas oftentimes, even within USA Rugby, for trans men, it's like, why do you say you're a man? Go play. You know, and it's like, if you're making this big argument about testosterone dictating whether you're like athletically successful or safe or strong or fast, you don't have any requirements for trans men to meet those levels or guidelines. Like, do you actually care about player safety? You know, I think it's great that that access is available to folks, but it seems like this kind of hypocritical argument. You know, a lot of the trans men I talk to, they talk about this like different kind of oppression they face, which is invisibility, right? Like, they're not in the spotlight, and I will say the spotlight's not awesome right now, but their experience is just totally overlooked, and it's ignored, and it's not talked about, and I also don't think that's fair, because I think they do have a place in sport as well, in men's sport, you know? So I think there's a lot more we can talk about on that topic.
Yeah, and just to add to that point, Grace, and to Jordan's point, I think there's a fear from perhaps the non-transgender community in terms of like, I am not equipped with the vocabulary, with the life experience, with the understanding of how to even start this conversation, right? So I think folks act in a self-preserving way and they just avoid the conversation entirely because it's a safer alternative than saying something stupid, right? Or coming across as ignorant, right? Or coming across as my opinion is based on something other than my total just unknowing of the subject, right? And then, you know, I put myself in a position where I'm unable to recover from that, right? I ruin a relationship or I close off a friendship or something along those lines. So to your point around allyship, to your point around conversations, these are the types of scenarios where I'm, you know, encouraged that we have an opportunity to have this discussion because I think it breaks those walls down such that you can have an intelligent conversation, an empathetic conversation, knowing that I don't know enough about the subject to form an intelligent, articulate point of view, but I'm willing to put myself out there, and I feel like if other, you know, perhaps folks on the men's side, even on the women's side, they're able to approach that subject, right? It's just, I think it's nice.
Yeah, I think we do live in like a cancel-y culture, and it's scary. It's scary around her, it's scary around race, it's scary around all, like, lots of different intersectional identities. And also, I think just, you know, feeling, even if that's a personal opinion, like, I don't have the language, no one does. Like, truly, I did not have the language 10 years ago for my own identity. Like, so just that, hopefully, like, in the realm of where our phobia and fear is, how to engage, is a little normalizing. Like, someone who's a trans person didn't have the word for themselves, you know, 10 years ago.
Absolutely. I think one of the things, and I think I mentioned when we're doing like preliminary calls or whatnot, like, I, as a trans person, know the difference between like a violent question, one that's like rooted in transphobia or like trying to catch me up or whatever, and one that's just like a curious question. Somebody wants to like learn more. And the reason I do stuff like this, like, you know, speak on panels with Athlete Ally, like I do a lot of Instagram advocacy, is I love talking about my experience as a trans athlete in sport, because I think it's super unique, and I think it's a super cool example of the diversity of the experience. So I love creating spaces where people can just like ask me questions, you know, and I'm like, I'll tell you if a question is kind of offside. I'll be like, maybe don't ask that to the next trans person, but you know, I had to ask trans people weird questions to figure out that I was trans, right? Like, it's, everybody's learning all the time, and I think if we don't ask those questions, we're not going to move past this place of misinformation.
And taking that sort of sports approach to these conversations, like, you don't just walk on a pitch and are like exceptional at rugby, right? There's the expectation is that it's mistakes and practice and learning, and you need the people beside you. And I think it's a good metaphor for like how we want to try to be.
I almost missed my first try because I didn't know to put the
ball
down. Like, teammates screaming at me in the tries. I'm like, touch the ball down. I had no idea. You know, I didn't ask the question. Right? I didn't want to sound stupid.
Yeah, basically, you know, we were talking like a lot of what we've been sharing. I think we'll continue to talk about is like this physical advantage. I really think a lot about the other advantages that are not just like physical advantages that get sort of eliminated in this conversation, whether it's like a socioeconomic advantage or it's a geographic advantage, or it's like you played sports a lot growing up advantage. There's so many different advantages that we could focus on. And I do think one of the things that I found as a trans person sometimes is like, if my physical advantage is being so spotlighted, I want also the like, you know, emotional challenge of being a trans person in life and also on teams to be honored. Like, I have navigated through mental challenges, emotional challenges that my cis teammates have never had to think about, and I'm showing up, and I'm in practice, and I'm, like, performing at a high level. I think that's impressive, the same way that anybody else who's going through something that's like deeply personal or emotional is still able to get themselves to a place of wanting to excel and be performing at a level. It's a credit, in my opinion, to them. So I just think that it's such an interesting sort of emphasis on the advantage of physicality without really like lifting up, I don't want to use language like disadvantage, but the barriers and challenges that a lot of trans people who are athletes are navigating. Like, think about Leah Thomas showing up every single swim meet with all of that hate, like that is a kind of incredible thing, regardless of what one's opinions are about the different levels of like where people should be participating in sport. So just wanted to share it. I don't know if it's an actual question, but I'm talking about it. Yeah.
So for everybody, what do you know about USA Rugby's current policy about transgender athletes? And if you're familiar with it, do you believe that it's fair or it needs improvement?
Yeah, I know the basics. I know that it's an attempt at sort of forming this sort of scientific sort of classing, sort of, where it's trying to say if you're transitioning to female or performing as a female, then you have to have some measurement of testosterone, or not too much of some measurement of testosterone over some amount of time. It's I think sort of a coarse attempt at like trying to capture what the advantage that male physical performance has over females, like in sort of the average natural case, or I should say the average case, and they're attempting to do that, and I don't know if it's right or well done, and I'm certain there's better, more nuanced ways to figure it out, but my understanding is that's what they're trying to take a crack at there.
USA Rugby's formal policy is based on the International Olympic Committee's guidelines that were in place since 2003, so if you didn't know, trans people have been allowed to compete in the Olympics since 2003. They were updated in 2015, and USA Rugby defers to them. So they say if you are transitioning to playing sports, so from being assigned female at birth to play men's sports, there are no regulations. Just say you're a man, go out there, have fun. If you're transitioning to play women's sports, you have to have had a testosterone level in your body lower than 10 nanomoles per liter for a 12-month period, and then be able to demonstrate through 3-month intervals that that is maintained throughout your entire playing career. And the 10 nanomole per liter figure is to capture what the range of quote-unquote natural testosterone levels are for the average cis woman. I can say for myself, because I do get these tests every 3 months, my hormones are like well below 5 nanomoles per liter, sometimes even below 2 or 1 nanomoles per liter, which is on the very like lower end of the cis female average. But that is what the policy is currently.
With that thorough explanation from Grace, do you guys have any feelings? I'm sure you have more thoughts about the policy itself.
Yeah, listen, again, to reiterate my point from earlier, I don't have enough lived experience to determine whether or not that's fair, right? And fair is a loaded term. Fair to who, right? Unfair to who, right? So I think from that perspective, I'd really love to, I don't mean to answer your question with a question, but I'm very curious to hear from the trans athletes, do you think it's fair, right? What are the improvements? What are the steps that you would like to see USA Rugby or the committee take towards having a more sort of thoughtful policy?
So I think foundationally, you start from a place of inclusion and say, you want to be in our sport, come into our sport, we're going to find a place for you, right? I think those sorts of classifications become much more important the more competitive you get in rugby, right? I think if it's a community organization, playing low-level rugby, we're going to have a conversation, we're going to figure it out, and we're going to see where we can get you to play. Maybe it's touch rugby, maybe it's whatever, right? We want to get you in the community. As you get more competitive, and I'm going to speak from my lived experience, I believe as a lifelong athlete that the hormone replacement therapy rule is important for differentiating between men's and women's rugby because it's a contact sport, because there's some danger involved there. And the reason I say this is not because I believe that pre-hormone replacement therapy me would have been a threat to the cis women on my team, but because I know if at this stage of my transition I was made to play on a men's team, I would get severely injured and I would be absolutely the worst person on that team simply based on my biology. And this is because I have tracked my performance as a trans athlete throughout my transition over the years that I've been on hormones, and I've seen a marked decrease in things like, my body mass, in terms of like my PRs in the gym, in terms of my minute mile, in terms of my VO2 max, like all these sorts of things. There is something about the science for that to be changing between cis men and trans women as they transition hormonally. It's never going to be a perfect science, right? Like, people always talk about cis men always being better than cis women, like we mentioned earlier, in all cases. And in reality, like, we're talking about statistical populations, right? Like, they're bell curves.
It's a bimodal situation.
Exactly.
There's a lot of middle there.
There's a lot of overlap, and like, one of the things that I've learned working with Athlete Ally is like those two bell curves have become closer and closer, more overlapping. As cis women or women's sports have been allowed to flourish, right? The longer women have been allowed to play sports, the closer that gap comes. Better equipment, better conditioning, better facilities, better coaching, it closes that gap, So I think there's a lot more to the conversation than just, let's put you in a bucket based on whether you cross a 10 threshold this 3-month period or not, right? But I definitely think it's better than where we're at in the conversation now in a lot of sports, where they're like, we're not even going to bother thinking about it, we're just going to ban you full out. I think that is not the foundation that we should start from if we want to talk about building sports that are inclusive and accessible to all people.
Yeah, and there are more and more bans that are coming. Like there's a lot of, even within the college system, there's a lot of policy that's being rolled back. And so I think also, again, thinking about the values of rugby as a sport, and rugby in the US also being a sport that is lesser in the mainstream, sometimes that allows you to be a little bit more creative, a little bit more like pushing the boundaries on things and, bolder. So thinking about like what role does rugby want to play culturally as we have these conversations is interesting. And you mentioned too when we were talking just on the break, which I thought was interesting, rugby is also one of these sports where everyone's bodies do look really different, and I remember being on the women's side and like playing against really big and also like really great rugby players who were cis women, who were Eagles. I was not. Like, there was a real difference in just like what that physical experience is. And so it is also the sport where I think we get the opportunity to think a bit creatively about these different elements. And at the same time, I too, as a trans person, do think that the science, there are aspects of when you get to a sort of competitive level, and I think that's the real differentiation, is that the conversation is often not like threaded in a way that I think is important, that it's valuable to have regulation, and it's valuable to consider the same way that, as we were talking about earlier, in any sport, you can't just like take steroids and do, perform in the sport. There's appropriate regulation in sport. And at the same time, I think the way in which it's been approached is just more blanket and harmful. And so if rugby can continue to be this like forward-thinking, real destination for where we want sports to go, then I'm, in favor of it having as inclusive a policy as possible.
Yeah, I agree with that, and I feel like as New York Rugby Club, we have people in leadership on this panel. I know you guys have, I think, both been on the board for a while. I guess, what do you think are some ways that we could, like, make our club more radically trans inclusive? Like, I know right now we're a diverse organization, we say all of that in writing, but I feel like there's definitely a lot of steps we could take to make it a better environment for trans people on both teams. So I'm just curious if anyone had any thoughts on that.
I think today is the perfect example of where you start. To be perfectly honest, being a part of the board, I've had the privilege to be in many different situations with many different conversations with how do we think about sponsorship, how do we think about recruitment, how do we think about diversity and inclusion on a broad scale, right? Like, I've had the opportunity to have these discussions with folks. This is the first time we're having, or at least I have the privilege to have this discussion about this specific topic and realize the importance of it, right? So this is the first opportunity where I'm saying, how can we better educate some of the men's players? How can we better educate the public about what rugby values means and what rugby values mean, what rugby values we want to in turn sort of showcase to our community, right? Like that's where I think we should start. But that's great.
I think from a trans athlete perspective, like one of the big things we can do is just make it clear to folks, especially in this climate, that like rugby is still one of those sports where like we got rules on the books that will allow you to play if you are a trans person. You want to play with the side that is more appropriate for your gender identity, right? And that's becoming more and more rare. And like what an awesome recruiting opportunity that is to like bring new people into the sport and people who are probably pretty athletic, right? Like they've played other sports. There are those really brave people like, yeah, rugby, first sport ever, let's just go and figure it out, right? I am not one of those people. Like, if I had not played like physical sports my entire life, I don't think rugby would have been the place where I would have jumped in. But, you know, like the more people on the team, the better, in my opinion, right? The more diverse experience, the more diverse skill sets and athletic ability we have on the team, the more successful we're going to be as a club, right? We're going to win more if we have people who are good at sports, right? So why can't we do that? Why can't we make it known? Like NYRC is a safe haven for you guys. Like we will find a place for you. We will make it happen, and it's maybe not going to be the easiest thing in the world, but we're going to put in the work because we just want more people on the team.
All right, so you spoke earlier about like some reasons that you might feel people might feel uncomfortable talking about, like asking open questions to trans people. So I guess for you guys specifically, do you have any good questions to ask in this space specifically to trans athletes or trans people in general?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. Look, this is a highly politicized topic, right? So like, what are some good resources that are out there that you think do a really good job of trying to portray sort of unbiased and provide both sides? Like, what are some of the resources that I can go to try and educate myself on the subject?
Yeah, sure, I'd love to. So I was on the host organization Athlete Ally for 3 years, and now I'm a staff member.
Mm-hmm.
And it is in the landscape of this topic of trans inclusion in sport, the leader in research and dialogue and conversations and lived experience in a way that I think really does center resources for teams and leagues, whether it's about trying to figure out what we want our policy to look like, or just like what kinds of conversations can we have. There's a curriculum that's free, accessible online, built by Athlete Ally called Champions of Inclusion that, you know, we can send the links around to everybody, but it's a less than an hour guide for how to, there are different modules, but basically it's for at different levels of sport, how do you talk about this topic? So there are those resources out there, and I think certainly going to the source about the Ally will be informative, and then there are others through Athlete Ally and other organizations that are doing this work, maybe some other ones too to just plug.
Yeah, so you can always ask me, your friends. So
Yeah,
just you can ask me some questions. Rugby specific, so myself and a number of other rugby players around the country, some other members of NYRC, we started an organization called Rugby for All back when World Rugby, way before a lot of these legislative things happened, passed a blanket ban on trans women at the elite levels, which was kind of messed up. We started this organization that specifically talks about like trans women and trans athletes in rugby. So we post a lot of like Instagram infographics. We have a open letter you can sign on to asking for that policy to be reversed. A lot of resources compiled, so you can go to rugbyforall.co or at rugbyforall.co on Instagram and find that. Yeah, there's a lot of like influencers and things like that on Instagram. If you follow rugbyforall.co, you'll get connected to a ton of them. But those are some really good spaces. And then the last one, you know, being actually serious about, you know, chatting with me about it. If you do read something about a trans athlete in like a major media outlet or something like that, just run it by a trans person you know and be like, hey, is this your experience, you know? Because again, they often don't actually talk to trans people about this, right? And the only person who should be the authority on an experience is the person who has it themselves.
So earlier you had said that like you've been through some experiences. What was it like going through like male puberty and then having to make this change and progress through your career that way?
So the male puberty gets brought up a lot when we're talking about like inherent advantages between you know, cis women and trans women, right? And there's a number of different arguments that get thrown around about like body shape and size, about bone density you hear about, like the size of your hands, these sorts of things. And you know, you can see me, I'm like 5'7", 145 pounds. I'm a fairly like slight person. And it just, again, goes to speak to the fact that like there is no one archetype of cis man, cis woman, trans man, right? There's so much diversity in all of those sorts of things. So you can't just say, oh, you went through this experience, therefore you are better in these categories. Puberty was really hard as a trans person, you know, and I didn't have the language to explain what I was going through. But, you know, I will say that being a teenager and playing in men's sports was actually really helpful for me to develop my skills as an athlete because of how many additional resources like boys in men's sports get. So I think that if there is any advantage puberty may have given me, it might have been just playing boys team sports, right? And having access to awesome conditioning, great coaches. You know, I was a travel soccer and basketball player. All of that kind of stuff does put you at an advantage over predominantly like women and folks who don't play in sports. But that also is the same as if you had money. You know, you're a kid who didn't have money like me, right? You don't have the best equipment, you don't have access to the PPE, you don't have access to these sorts of things, right? So, you know, you mentioned this earlier, it's so much more than just how your body is and how it changes. It's about the whole holistic view of your sporting career and your environment, right? Last thing I'll say is the bone density thing is kind of nonsense. If you have denser bones, you're heavier, and if you have less power to propel a heavier object, you move slower. So I'm going to hit you less hard because I'm less strong and I have heavier bones. Doesn't make sense logically. So if you hear that one, you can just throw that out the window.
The puberty thing is actually interesting too because, especially at those ages, they're not even hitting puberty at the same time. I remember being on my younger soccer teams, the girls were better than everybody because they were just more developed anyway. Do you have any view on how that factors into, like, why are we even dividing kids up that way? Like, does it even make sense at that age? Is there something you have an opinion on that at all, or?
I do, right? And like, this is what really keeps me up at night and makes me really sad, is so much of this hateful rhetoric is targeted at children right now, you know? It's like, it's one thing if you're an adult, it sucks if you lose access to sports. I have a therapist, you know, I will get through it for sure, it would suck. I read an article in NPR the other day about this 15-year-old trans girl who started hormone blockers when she was 8, has never gone through male puberty, plays on the girls' soccer team, has for 4 or 5 years, and it's her entire life. It's her community, it's her support network, it's all of her friends. She plays varsity, she's so excited, you know, she wants to go in and play in college. And in New Hampshire, they're about to pass a blanket ban on trans children playing in sports that align with their gender identity. And they specifically target trans girls. And this girl who has done nothing wrong, followed all of the so-called rules, is going to lose access to everything that makes her happy in life, right? And I don't understand where that is coming from, besides a place of just unadulterated hate and misunderstanding, right? And those are the people I worry about, because these kids who are already bullied for being the people that they are need access to sport, frankly, so they can stay alive and grow to be trans adults, right? And that's why I fight so hard for this kind of stuff. I want to see these kids become adults, you know.
I want to ask Grace and Jordan. I know you guys both talked about like playing sports throughout your life, playing sports as children, and then like playing sports now. I know you retired a while back, but still being active.
I played pickleball.
Like a all for different seasons. Yeah. So I guess like at all of the points in your transition, can you talk about some things that made you feel safe as a trans athlete in sports, like either from gender queer teammates or cis teammates?
For me, I think growing up raised female and playing women's sports, I have found women's sports just be like the epicenter of safety and inclusivity. And I want that for everyone. I want like what is modeled within women's sports culture to be modeled for everybody. So specifically for me, it was pretty, when I was younger, I didn't have the language as we've been talking about before. I knew that I was queer, but I never identified as a lesbian because I didn't identify fully as a woman. And so for me, sports was this place where I felt like my overly muscular kind of, you know, not feminine body was like valued, and where I was valued in this way that just truly made the difference in my ability to like feel okay about myself, and to feel like, desired on like a level of teaming, to feel like powerful, to feel good, and not awkward, where I felt awkward in like pretty much every other physical space. So that's one thing. And then when I was in college and going to Wesleyan, which was this place that was really embracing of queer identity and through sport and through West Rugby, it really like welcomed me into this part of myself that, by that point I was out and ready to be in a queer space, but sports specifically was this like center haven. And then with NYRC, I mean, truly, like, I met my partner playing, and has forever been this anchor of closeness and connection, and starting with like internal closeness and connection, and then move into my most important relationships.
There have been so many like moments over the course of my sporting career as a trans woman where I felt really safe and really included in women's sports. I'll give a couple examples. So one was with my first rugby team. I played for San Francisco Golden Gate, who's no longer a team. I knew I needed to come out to my coach. I wouldn't have felt good if I hadn't come out to my coach about my identity. And I was so scared to come out to her. She's a wonderful woman named Emma Hadfield. And I came out to her and she's like, you have nothing to worry about. Let me go figure out policy. I'll let you know if there's anything to do. We're just happy you're here, And it, like, she follows me on Instagram. She still hypes up the rugby that I'm playing, right? And it was amazing to play under somebody like that. When the World Rugby stuff was happening, we started Rugby for All. The Berkeley All Blues, who's my old team, out of the blue, pun intended, they sent me just a $200 scholarship for the work that I had been doing and the advocacy work I'd been doing. And they're like, because of the work that you're doing, we have actually decided to revamp our code of conduct to be more explicit about including trans athletes in sports. I went on to play with them. I went to the D2 National Championship with them. We got completely rocked, but it was, nonetheless. And the last one I'll say, and this was within NYRC, and it was really meaningful to me. It got to a point last winter where the anti-trans stuff was going on was so bad that I was like on the verge of a mental breakdown, and I was coming to practice so anxious that something was going to happen that was going to like thrust me into some national media spotlight, and I'd get death threats and hate comments and all this kind of stuff, that I had to go to Coach K and be like, I can't play this winter. Like, I need to focus on getting my mental health together. And she was like, thank you so much for telling me, we're going to be here when you're ready to come back, and all of us are here for you in whatever way you need. And it's like moments like that that remind me that there is a place in sport for trans people, and that it's important we have these conversations because we can fight to continue to correct that niche for them.
And then I think just as a wrap up, is there anything you are going to take away from this conversation and bring to the people that weren't here, like do differently in the season going forward?
I feel a lot more comfortable having conversations with the men's team now about this, which is awesome. Yeah, you guys, sometimes I feel scared to have those conversations, but I just want to hang out with you guys now. So.
Yeah, I mean, I'd say I'm looking forward to like, the board is producing its DI policy so we can make it like a fill and real to people that's like, hey, like it's comfortable to be here, and if there's a problem, like you can talk to people about it, and even just content like this, maybe it could just become an advertising thing about letting people know that this is a place to do that kind of stuff. So.
If nothing else, the only thing I want to get out of this is that like New York Rugby Club is a place that we actually talk the talk and walk the walk. Right? Like, we want to be a club that's inclusive. We want to be a club where you can get everything that I've gotten out of this rugby experience and the rugby community. I want everyone to have an opportunity. I want everyone to have, as Jordan mentioned, that experience of what sports provides, and the fact that nobody's going to feel limited based off of how they feel about themselves, how they identify themselves, knowing that New York Rugby Club is a space where you can come, regardless of your background, regardless of who you identify, as long as you're the person that wants to go out and play rugby and have a good time and aligns with the values of what rugby means, like, you are welcome here.
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, I'm not an active player, but I think that there is this, like for the club mentality and alumni mentality, and, really being able to feel like that exists across anyone's experience. It feels newer to me. Like when I think about NYRC, I do think about the women's side. I'm thinking like leading this conversation, what does the future of the club like, that where there are these like holistic approaches and values across both teams. And I think that that's really, hopeful and exciting. And I think the women's team has made shifts on its trans inclusion policy in the last, 5-6 years as well. And so it's like, there's more opportunity for us all to move that forward.
Yeah, I thought it was really encouraging that you guys were willing to come and like have representation for the men's team.
Yeah, love it.
I think it's a good conversation to have.
I'm so happy we did this, guys.
Yeah.
This is awesome. It's good. Thank you all for taking the time to tune in and listen to our chat today. I hope this is the start of a lot of really fantastic conversations wherever you're tuning in from, ideally within your rugby club, your sporting community, otherwise. Appreciate you joining us on Trans Day of Visibility, and I hope you learned something tonight. Thanks so much.